Migration Policy Development and the European University Institute. What we're going to be talking about this afternoon is displacement from Ukraine outside of Europe. The title of the webinar is Farther from Home, Pathways to Protection Beyond the EU for Those Fleeing Ukraine. I'm going to chair the event, hand over to Martin Wagner, my colleague from ICMPD, who will then moderate a conversation between our four speakers. I'm very happy to introduce these four expert speakers to you briefly. So in the order in which I'll speak, first of all, we will hear from Corinne Prince, who is Director General, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship in Canada. Very happy also to welcome Susan Fratzka, who's a Senior Policy Analyst with the Migration Policy Institute's International Program. We'll then hear from Maria Beatriz Nogueira, who is the head of the UNHCR field office in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and from Raul Hernandez Sagrera, who's a member of the Cabinet of Commissioner Ylva Johansson in the European Commission. It's a great pleasure to welcome them to this webinar today, and all of you who are joining us via YouTube. Just could I point out, for those of you who are joining us via YouTube, you are more than welcome to ask questions and comment on the discussion, but could you please do it in the comment section of the YouTube channel, and then we can moderate the questions that appear in that way. So we do welcome your contribution, and please feel free to do it that way via the YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over to Martin Wagner from ICMPD, who will moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction and the welcome. Also from my side, a very warm welcome to all of you who joined this webinar today. Before I introduce a bit of the program, or how we intend to have this program, I would like to provide a bit of a brief context for this webinar. The starting point for us at ICMPD is to look at solutions for displacement that go beyond the classical durable solutions, particularly new emerging initiatives that are often referred to as or under the umbrella of complementary pathways. Thus pathways that come in addition to and complementary to the classical third country solutions for refugees, namely resettlement. We have looked into such complementary pathways in recent research projects and other projects, but also, for example, in the draft. We have looked into such complementary pathways. Okay, this was now some back stopping, but continuing. We looked into this in the project called Traffic, which just recently concluded. And also in a more recent or just starting initiative funded also by the European Commission, DG Home, via the Migration Partnership Facility, but also a recent commentary published by my colleague, Caitlin Katseafikas, entitled Non-EU Pathways to Protection for Ukrainians, Complementary Pathways Gain Significant Momentum. This was a bit the starting point. And secondly, we are currently facing an unprecedented situation of displacement in Europe from Ukraine due to the Russian invasion and the resulting conflict. And this displacement situation is unprecedented in respect of scale and pace. And it is indeed the biggest crisis in Europe, displacement crisis in Europe since the Second World War. But what we also see is that every crisis situation also opens doors for new and sometimes creative solutions. We see this in the EU with the activation of Temporary Protection Directive. And we see this also with initiatives to use existing or create new pathways for people fleeing, in this case, the war in Ukraine outside of Europe. And this brings us to this webinar and the composition of this webinar. What we would like to do is, what we aim to do is first to learn and better understand which pathways Canada, the US and Brazil have opened for people fleeing the war in Ukraine. Secondly, also to understand what coordination is required between the countries of origin, Ukraine, the first countries first host countries, mainly EU plus countries, so mainly countries in the region, and those destination countries farther afield, and here we look at Canada, US and Brazil. So In other words, what coordination structures are needed to open such pathways, and is there coordination needed? And the third aim of this webinar would be to see what lessons do we already now see, and how can these lessons help us also to create pathways to protection also in other refugee contexts. For this webinar, we will have basically 2 rounds of rather short questions, which we hope that will leave us then some 15 minutes time for questions. And Andrew already invited you to pose your questions on YouTube. And we would like then to collect the questions and still have some time to answer them. Now, Andrew already introduced briefly our stellar panel here. I'm very glad that we have this very different composition of this panel from different countries, plus also from the European Commission here. And I would like to directly jump into the topic that we have, and I would like to start with Corinna. Corinna, Canada is well known as a global leader in refugee resettlement, and the current program for people fleeing the war in Ukraine, I would say, goes beyond these efforts, and in this also complements these resettlement efforts. Now, just to have a start and to also better understand what Canada currently is doing, which pathways have been opened, for whom, and also why, and how is Canada working to coordinate also these responses across the different immigration channels within the administration. And probably you could also have a word on the impact or the role of Ukrainian diaspora in spurring migration pathways to Canada. Please, Corinne, I would like to hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Martin and Andrew, for the kind invitation. I'm very pleased to be with you all today with colleagues from the US, Brazil, and the European Commission. Martin, you mentioned Ukrainian diaspora, and yes, believe that Canada is the country that has the largest Ukrainian diaspora outside of Ukraine. And so there has been an incredible lashing out of support from not only Ukrainian Canadians, but Canadians overall. So on March 17th of this year, our government introduced a special temporary visa that we call the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel. It's a long name. We call it SUAT, so I will use that acronym. And this is to put in place the quickest and fastest way to get Ukrainian nationals to Canada. It's a streamlined visa process with an ability to apply for an open work permit or a study permit for up to 3 years. I want to be clear that this is a temporary residence pathway. It is not a refugee stream. And following engagement and consultations with the Ukrainian Canadian community, we were advised that many Ukrainians that come to Canada may certainly want to return home when it is safe to do so, and that a temporary visa was the fastest and most efficient way to provide that quick entry, but also a return home. So it's a visa that will allow them multiple entrants to Canada over a 10-year period. Although it's temporary in nature, Ukrainian nationals may apply to extend the visa beyond the 3 years and actually apply for permanent residence once they land. This has posed a number of policy challenges to the teams in our department. We have had to pretty much reconstruct a refugee pathway or a refugee-like pathway with a temporary visa mechanism. As of the end of June, we have had, since March 17th, over 350,000 Ukrainians applying for this special visa. And to date, over 148,000 have been approved to come to Canada. How many have arrived? Since January, we have been tracking both Ukrainian nationals that have come in, as well as nationals on this SUAT visa. And as of today, we have 55,400 Ukrainian citizens or SUAT visa holders who have arrived on Canadian soil since January the 1st. So I mentioned the policy challenges. We have amended the terms and conditions of our settlement program. Normally, we don't provide settlement services to visitors. We expect visitors to come and leave. But in this case, we've extended all of our settlement services with over 550 settlement providers across Canada to provide settlement services to Ukrainian nationals with the SUAT visa. Our Prime Minister announced 3 federal charters, bringing over 900 Ukrainians over the past few weeks into Winnipeg, Montreal, and Halifax. We've also stood up a one-time transitional financial support for all of these SUAT visa holders. This will provide to adults 3,000 Canadian dollars and to every child 1,500 Canadian dollars as a way for them to get a good start in Canada. In addition to that, we've stood up temporary hotel accommodations free of charge for up to 2 weeks. And that has gone live just this week. In addition to that, we have a contract with the Canadian Red Cross at key ports of entry, international airports across Canada, which provides information and referral services to Ukrainians landing in Canada. I think in addition to what the federal government has done, our provinces and territories have added a number of services across the country, which I won't go into, but I hope that provides a pretty good description at a high level of the Canadian pathway for Ukrainian nationals. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this introduction to responses from Canada. I already see here 3 quite interesting points that are quite specific and different to other refugee situations. I just noted 3, and the first one is supporting mobility with these chartered flights that you just mentioned. I think the second one also is always quite interesting in this Ukrainian context is the allowance of multiple entries, so which allows to go back and forth, something what we also see in the European context actually. And also you pointed to the role of diaspora networks and how they facilitate this kind of additional pathways that were opened. So I think thanks a lot. This is already gives us a first good hint. And with this, I would like to move over to Susan and turning to the US, which also is traditionally a leader in refugee resettlement. Also, the US has worked to make these existing pathways known to people and seeking to come to the country from Ukraine. But it also complements this, as I understood, with this new initiative called Uniting for Ukraine. So yeah, Susan, how does this Uniting for Ukraine and other initiatives complement resettlement, and what type of legal pathways does it open, or what kind of, or what makes it easier to compared to typical immigration channels? So please, Susan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Martin. I'm very happy to talk about the US experience because I think beyond the immediate crisis in Ukraine, it really illustrates some of the advantages and trade-offs that have developed around complementary pathways more broadly, as you mentioned at the beginning, Martin, and something that's really emerged as an important part of broader humanitarian response in the last few years. So as you mentioned, Martin, there's actually several different ways in which displaced Ukrainians have entered the US since February, and most of that has actually happened outside alongside the traditional refugee resettlement program. So when the crisis first began, admissions were primarily the result of Ukrainians and their family and friends taking matters into their own hands. About little more than 30,000 Ukrainians traveled to the US on existing visas that had already been issued in the first few months after the war began, including things like tourist visas. And those individuals were eventually granted a temporary protected status, which enables them to stay in the US at least while the war continues. In addition, there were more than 20,000 people who traveled to the US southern border with Mexico and sought asylum at the border. And many of those arriving didn't have valid visas, but they were admitted by US officials while their asylum claims were pending on something called Humanitarian Parole Authority. And that allows officials to admit individuals for humanitarian reasons, even if they don't have a valid visa. And I mention this because neither of those cases were actually the result of formal US policy, and in particularly arrivals at the US southern border with Mexico, which has been a major policy challenge, I think was quite concerning to officials who wanted to be supportive of Ukraine, but also wanted to ensure that they weren't adding to the pressure on the southern border, which has really been a political challenge for the US government. So at the end of April, the government announced a new program that would allow displaced Ukrainians to enter the US without going through Mexico, even if they didn't already have a valid visa. And this is the Uniting for Ukraine program. Like the Canadian response that Corinne described, it's a temporary admissions program, but it's quite different in other ways in that it's essentially a sponsorship program. So it really relies on private individuals and Ukrainians themselves to organize and pay for their journeys and their arrival in the US. The program specifically allows individuals who are living in the US lawfully, so not necessarily citizens, but who have some sort of lawful residence, to apply to sponsor Ukrainians to enter the United States. They have to provide proof that they have the resources to support Ukrainian beneficiaries. So this means things like providing housing, healthcare, helping them enroll in school and complete paperwork. The sponsorship application has to be filed by an individual, but they can have a group behind them supporting them. To be eligible, Ukrainians have to have been living in Ukraine through February 11th of this year, and they also have to pass a set of security and health checks, but there aren't really any other requirements or eligibility restrictions. So it's really quite an open and flexible program. And that's allowed the program to move very quickly and much more quickly than traditional refugee resettlement programs do. By the end of June, more than 17,000 Ukrainians had entered under the program. 24,000 have been approved and are waiting to travel, and another 66,000 individuals in the US have submitted sponsorship applications. And by contrast, since the war began, just 300 people have arrived in the US from Ukraine through traditional resettlement channels. So Uniting for Ukraine has really been incredibly nimble, and it's clearly tapped into a willingness on the part of American people to support Ukraine. 66,000 sponsorship applications is really quite a lot. I think, given that we are just a few months out from the beginning of the war, and the US has no, traditionally has not had a refugee sponsorship program. But there's some real limitations to this program that stem from the fact that it's not really sitting under the umbrella of a traditional resettlement program. And I wanted to highlight two issues in particular. One, Parole Authority, which is the authority that's been used to admit people coming from Ukraine under Uniting for Ukraine, is temporary. So Ukrainians will be allowed to stay in the US for up to 2 years, potentially with the possibility of renewing that, and they are given work authorization, but there is no pathway for the longer term or for permanent stay beyond those 2 years. And the US government at this point isn't able to do that independently. It would require authorization from the US legislature, from Congress, to actually do that. And there aren't really signs at the moment that that's going to happen. They can apply for residency based on family ties or another type of visa, or submit asylum claims, but the US asylum system is really backlogged. So that's not really the best option. Also, because this isn't a formal humanitarian program, Ukrainians aren't eligible for many of the benefits that are typically given to refugees, and sponsors should be picking up some of those responsibilities. But because of the way the program is developed, the fact that it's very quick and an ad hoc program, there isn't really a formal system sitting around it to necessarily support sponsors and ensure that that's happening. So I think we're left with something of a mixed bag. It's an incredibly nimble program that's provided a critical lifeline to thousands of Ukrainians, and it's been extremely innovative. And we can touch on some of those innovations, specific innovations later. But it also has the potential to leave individuals in precarious situations if we don't also build up some of the surrounding infrastructure necessary to really see a program like this succeed. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks a lot. There were already quite a few things you touched upon, but again, interesting, this new element that came in, bit of creative, what I mentioned before, using sponsorship more pronounced here, and I also quite amazing actually if you see the scale of complementarity here. You mentioned that the numbers for resettlement in this period versus the number that came via the new schemes here. This is quite remarkable, I think, but also of course the downsides, and I think we will come back to this one more time a bit later. Hopefully, this temporarity of the status, something that is also big discussed in the framework of temporary protection in Europe, of course. But I also sensed the difficulties that come in with a new system, which could potentially then also itself lead to precarity. And I think I hope we come back to that in the second round still. Thanks a lot for that. I think we move now further south to Maria Beatriz. Maria Beatriz, Brazil has initiated humanitarian visas for Ukrainian nationals. Probably you can tell us a bit what benefits does this visa provide, and how do or can Ukraine also move further on from these humanitarian visas for probably more longer term resident status, if there is such an opportunity? And probably in general, how is UNHCR assisting Brazilian government in its efforts to provide responses from Brazilian sides for Ukrainians? Please, Maria Beatriz.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Martin, for the invitation. Yes, in March this year, the government of Brazil issued a decree creating a humanitarian visa for Ukrainian nationals, not only Ukrainian nationals, but also for stateless persons who were affected by the Ukrainian situation. So this was an innovation of this decree. So those who are stateless, who have no passport or no documentation, can also benefit from that. The Brazilian government may issue a temporary passport or a laissez-passer for people to be able to come to Brazil and regularly. This is, I think, the fifth kind of humanitarian visa that Brazilian authorities have created. The first one was for Haitian nationals after the earthquake, and then Syria, and then Afghanistan. So we have a kind of a tradition to creating this kind of humanitarian visa through decree, which is very much praised by UNHCR, because creates a good pathway for those who want to come to Brazil regularly. And this visa is issued by all the embassies in the neighboring countries of Ukraine. So in terms of transforming the temporary residency to the permanent one, this is already foreseen as an option. Those who come visa to Brazil, they are able to apply for asylum, and they will more likely be recognized as refugees, because Brazil has a very, in the Brazilian refugee law, it is foreseen not only the traditional definition, but also the broader refugee definition. And we already have decisions from the National Committee on Refugees recognizing those Ukrainians fleeing the situation of an armed conflict, of a generalized human rights violation. So not in need of trying to prove individual persecution, if you will. So the asylum pathway is wide open, and the temporary residency pathway is also open. So an Ukrainian national can apply for a 2-year temporary residency permit that can be converted into a permanent residency permit after 2 years, if the person can prove to have means to stay in Brazil, economic, financial means, in order to stay in Brazil. So this is actually not a problem here. We don't, Brazilian authorities have no deportation or expulsion traditional means. So the idea is for people to be able to come and stay, and if they want to stay regularly and permanently. And this, from what we don't have the exact figures from the Brazilian government on how many visas were issued, but we have welcomed here, where I sit in the airport, International Airport of São Paulo, over 500 Ukrainians who came with the humanitarian visa and who were supported by civil society and religious organizations. So this is the main innovation of this scheme, because previously with the Haitians, with the Syrians, there were not any organization in terms of benefits, in terms of assistance for these populations. They could come, they could stay permanently, they could apply for asylum, but they had to search for the local protection networks in order to have some kind of support. So then UNHCR would have the partners and would support local governments and would support the local diasporas in order to assist. In this case, first in the Afghan case, and now in the Ukrainian case, we are seeing organized civil society and religious organizations trying to come up with specific support schemes for these, to assist these groups. And this was never done in Brazil before. So this is the complementary pathway scheme is leading the ground for a community sponsorship resettlement program that was never actually done in Brazil, because this is not the tradition of resettlement in the country. Historically, resettlement in Brazil was either financed by UNHCR or fully financed by the government, but very in smaller proportions. Now, these complementary pathways combined with support to religious groups or civil society organizations that are willing to come up with schemes to support these arrivals are leading the ground for the actual creation of a resettlement sponsorship program. Previously, UNHCR used to, in partnership with Canadian authorities, bring Brazilian officials to Canada to see how it was done in other countries, but it was still something further from the local experience. But now we are seeing with an unprecedented solidarity from the Brazilian society to help these groups. The local networks are looking to UNHCR and to other agencies to understand what would it take to build a program of 1 year, 6 months, 1 year of support with language inclusion, financial support, support with labor inclusion in order for them to be able to come and locally integrate in Brazil. So this is a new experience. The numbers are not big because, of course, the interest in coming to Brazil cannot be compared to those who wish to come to a big diaspora like Canada or US or even Europe. But there is this initiative is being very welcomed by UNHCR and can be in the future transform in wider resettlement program to benefit also not only Ukrainians but other nationalities.
Thanks a lot. Another similar to the sponsorship thing, but I think not yet so organized. But you see how civil society can come in here very prominently and provide the networks that are needed for people who are displaced in one form or the other. I think also shows very nicely how these two can connect to each other, this kind of mobility possibility with the humanitarian visa, plus the network on the other side that is coming up through civil society organizations and a nice umbrella under an initiative of humanitarian visas in this context. I think also I like this forward-looking thought that you have. It could also pave new initiatives in the future for other displacement situations. Thanks a lot for that. Now we heard already more or less from the three countries a bit in which directions each of the country are at the moment opening pathways that are actually innovative in many ways or new in many ways. I would like to look now a bit more into the importance of coordination mechanisms and what kind of cooperation forms are actually already in place, or which cooperation mechanisms are required in order to make it also happening but this time from the side of the major first host countries, in this case, the European Union. So I would like to turn to you, Raoul. We have now heard about these initiatives, and within the EU, there has established some coordination platform within the solidarity, the so-called solidarity platform. Now, my question would be, to what extent can such coordination mechanisms help? And probably you can also provide us some insights on what actually needs to be coordinated. Can such initiatives not simply be established like a humanitarian visa, and this can be shared with Ukrainians who are in EU countries, or what kind of coordination is there necessary, or how can it be supported by EU countries and the Commission, of course? Sorry.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you very much also, Andrea, both ICMPD and EY for the kind invitation. And I'm also I feel very honored and privileged to share this panel with Corinne, with Susan, and with Maria Beatriz. And I heard, let's say, the different details of the programs very attentively, because for us it's very important. It's actually one of the, we in the Commission designed a 10-point plan on the EU response to Ukraine, which includes as one of their points that we do a reinforced framework of cooperation for international cooperation on safe destinations, including with the partners outside the European Union. You know, contrary to Canada, the US, and Brazil, we are impacted as neighbors of Ukraine by the war in Ukraine. We have, as of yesterday, over 3,769,000 people who have applied for the Temporary Protection Directive that you already referred to, Martin, which provides automatic access to rights in the Union, to housing rights, health, education, and labor rights to all those who flee the war and come to the European Union. And we have also registered, and you referred also at some point to this entry-exit possibility or multiple entry, over 7.4 million entries since the outbreak of the war to our external borders. So this is the situation in which we are in at the moment in the European Union. And for us, it's very important that the coordination platform that we set up at the time, which is the Solidarity Platform, has been the forum which has allowed all member states, but not only, we have also our operational agencies, the Home Affairs agencies of the European Union, including the European Border Guards Agency, including Europol, because there's of course a dimension of internal security, which is linked to the impact of the war. We have also international partners. We have both Canada and the US taking part in it. I mean, this Solidarity Platform has allowed to, first and foremost, I would say, for an exchange of information, which is absolutely necessary to coordinate the efforts within the Union. We see that diaspora has played a key role also in the way Ukrainians have chosen their destination within the Union. This calls for a lot of coordination. So we really need to see also which member states are under more pressure than others. And the Commission is also ready to coordinate all these efforts, but also to support financially member states in hosting refugees. But going back to our cooperation with international partners, as I said, this allowing for this information exchange about what the programs are about, because we need Ukrainians to be aware, first of all, that there is this opportunity to be hosted in partners outside the European Union, and this is what we are promoting through the Solidarity Platform. What I wanted to say is that we already, well, actually our cooperation goes beyond Ukraine, in particular with Canada and the US. We had under the high-level resettlement forum that my Commissioner Johansson already called. We had, for example, a very good cooperation in response to the Afghanistan situation. we have an outstanding cooperation that goes beyond Ukraine. But let me finalize by referring to another third country, which is directly impacted by the war, which is the Republic of Moldova. And here we have a very close cooperation, in the sense that we have over 500,000 entries to Moldova, and Moldova is quite a small country of over 3 million inhabitants. About out of those 500,000, 77,000 remain in Moldova, and the others have gone to the European Union. But what is very important is that 110 people, 1,000 people, over 100,000 people from Ukraine that went through Moldova have now found refuge in Canada, the US, and the UK together. So to let's say finalize this my short intervention and going back to the coordination, it has been vital here, let's say, the role of the Solidarity Platform to really also include the dimension of having this transit country of Moldova coming into play, into providing the solidarity needed for Ukrainians that went through Moldova. Thank you.
Thanks for these insights to the Solidarity Platform, and also your views on what kind of cooperation is necessary there, and of course also for mentioning the role of Moldova as a direct neighboring country, and outside of the EU, but very closely in cooperation also with EU member states and other neighboring countries. Probably back to you, Corinne. How does this cooperation from the side of Canada look like? Where do you see the importance of cooperation, and what from your side needs to be coordinated also with partners in the European Union or Moldova, also with direct neighboring countries that host currently many Ukrainians? Yeah, probably also if there are any initiatives beyond the Solidarity Platform where you cooperate with EU member states, probably you can provide us some insights from the Canadian perspective here.
Thank you, Martin. As Raul said, cooperation with partners is extremely important. And we know that so many Eastern European countries have been very generous in welcoming Ukrainian nationals, but some countries, Poland in particular, and the mention of Moldova, do have capacity issues. And so having EU member states share information in real time and communicating regularly with Canada and other allied countries in an honest and transparent way has been extremely important. We continue to value our close relationship with the European Union and all of the EU member states based on those shared values and strong ties and history of cooperation. We, of course, are members of many other important networks, the OECD, UNHCR, but also on the settlement side, what we share with members of the Intergovernmental Consultation Organization is also very helpful. In April, our Prime Minister was a supporter of the Stand Up for Ukraine initiative, the pledging event with the President of the European Commission that raised over $12 billion in pledges globally. And I think when allies can come together like that to join forces, the impact is really important. So I can't say enough about the success and need for this open and transparent sharing of information, in particular that Raul has described to us.
And also probably follow-up question, how is there a coordination with, for example, the US or other countries in the region? Do you also coordinate there? Just
Yes, absolutely. Our department is in close contact with our U.S. colleagues, and certainly that was evident during the mass arrival of Syrian refugees, has been continued in terms of Afghan refugees, asylum seekers generally, but also now with the Ukraine. And you know, bi-weekly calls with our U.S. counterparts are really important in the North American context.
Thank you. Now, I would like to go a bit in direction of what does this Ukrainian responses tell us also for, or could tell us also for other crisis situations that come in the future. And I would like to turn to Maria Beatriz and Susan, probably to both of you. You mentioned quite a few interesting initiatives. They sounded now a bit as temporary installations in a way, and that should now build to the emerging need. Where do you see some possibilities of these initiatives for more sustainable pathways also in other refugee contexts? Can you see this, or where do you see the main lessons learned from this Ukrainian situation now? Probably we start again with Susan and then move to Maria Beatriz.
Sure. Thanks, Martin. I'm very happy to discuss that. I think as a starting point, it's worth noting that Ukraine isn't the first time we've seen these sorts of non-traditional humanitarian programs emerge. Just 6 months before the Ukrainian war broke out, of course, the world was scrambling to find pathways to admit Afghans who were displaced after their government fell. And I think both of these crises have really have really demonstrated the limits of traditional resettlement programs, particularly in crisis situations. And it's not just an issue of numbers. I think we've seen that there are at least 3 other limits of resettlement programs in emergency situations. First, resettlement programs really rely often on a very formal and managed process, usually run by UNHCR, to identify people who are in need of resettlement. And while this has definite strengths and advantages, in emergency situations, there often isn't the kind of established infrastructure for UNHCR or another organization to step in and make these kinds of identifications. And without that, it's difficult to get people into the resettlement pipeline. Second, resettlement as it currently operates can be slow and cumbersome. And I say can be slow and cumbersome because it doesn't have to be. And of course, there's a lot of discussion around innovations around how to change that. But often right now it is, and often requires a formal visa process. And in the US and some other countries, we often do the full refugee determination, in fact, before someone arrives. And that all takes time. And it's worth, looking at how that can be changed. But for the moment, that makes resettlement programs really not the nimble tool that's needed in these emergencies. And finally, resettlement numbers don't scale quickly. In many countries, numbers and priorities are set at least a year ahead of time, if not more. And there is some emergency flexibility in those quotas, but it can be difficult to really turn resettlement programs very rapidly, refocus them, or add huge numbers very quickly. So programs like Uniting for Ukraine get around this by relying on either humanitarian or emergency visa authorities, or in the case of the US now, relying on individuals to nominate people they know. So overcoming the barrier of not knowing who is vulnerable and who needs a pathway out. And the Uniting for Ukraine program in particular adopts the sponsorship model, which actually requires sponsors to cover many of the costs of the program and deal with the logistics, which can be easier from a political standpoint because you are relying on private resources to add large numbers of arrivals in response to an emergency. And Uniting for Ukraine and the Afghan Parole Program in the US before also dispensed with all or part of the usual visa process before people arrived, which hugely expedited the arrival process. And having that sort of nimbleness is really essential for emergency response and can help to alleviate the pressure on neighboring countries, such as those in Eastern Europe in the immediate neighborhood of a crisis. The other exciting thing about how these programs operate is how, particularly the Uniting for Ukraine program and similar ones, tap into individual willingness to help. As I mentioned earlier, there have been 66,000 applications still pending from sponsors in the US. And without programs like this, that allow the public to get involved, you actually leave those kinds of resources and opportunities for public engagement on the table. That can have an opportunity to be beneficial both in the case of Ukraine, but also I think as a way to engage broader publics within the resettlement system and help them to see and experience refugee support in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. So I do think there's really, very much a space for these types of programs in the humanitarian system going forward, and lots of lessons from Ukraine and Afghanistan. We do need nimble and responsive emergency pathways, and sponsorship programs like Uniting for Ukraine or the humanitarian visa or emergency visa programs we've heard about are one very accessible way to do that. One other interesting innovation, just to mention briefly, in the Uniting for Ukraine program has been this platform that a coalition of US and non-governmental partners and others set up that actually allows Ukrainian individuals to connect remotely with potential sponsors in the US. And I think that, not necessarily as a policy, it's not a policy innovation, but as a practical innovation could be something really interesting to explore more going forward, either within individual countries or even on a broader international level. But I think there's two also points of caution that we need to bear in mind going forward. One is that Uniting for Ukraine and its predecessor program for Afghans are, as I said earlier, very precarious for the individuals who travel on them. We need to be thinking about pathways to permanency when we set these programs up, as well as the need for oversight and support networks for individuals when they're arriving. And the Canadian program is extremely interesting in the ways that it's not a sponsorship program, but the ways in which Canada has adapted its settlement support infrastructure to account for these new arrivals coming through a non-traditional channel. The second point I think we need to consider is that these programs, both for Afghanistan, now for Ukraine, we're starting from scratch each time. And as a result, there are a lot of details that have to be resolved for each new program, including how new arrivals fit into existing benefits systems, who needs to be at the table for conversations. And at this point, 6 months after the Afghan crisis, or more than 6 months after the Afghan crisis, almost a year, and 4 months after the crisis in Ukraine, I think we need to recognize that there's a need for emergency valves within humanitarian pathways programs, including resettlement, and start to think about how to build that kind of responsiveness into our humanitarian pathways infrastructure in a more sustainable way going forward.
So I sense that there is a lot to what you say is a lot we can learn from this emergency support in this immediate opening of pathways, but in the long term we have to be more cautious with possible precarity, but also with regard, and I would also like to echo that, how sustainable are many of especially initiatives that are carried by civil society. You never know how sustainable it can be, no? So thanks a lot for that. Maria Beatriz, what would be your takes?
Yes, so thank you so much. And as I said, I think these experiences with complementary pathways are very important for us to, in countries like Brazil, to reshape the idea on how to conduct resettlement, because I echo also some of the concerns said by Susan on the limitations of resettlement programs. Here in Brazil, they used to be all financed by UNHCR or the government, who doesn't have enough budget to do it. Here in Brazil, there is a serious language barrier. So resettlement, these resettlement programs used to be very long and costly, and with very limited places. And mostly the resettlement done in Brazil used to be from people from the region who spoke Spanish. So the experience doesn't fit well with emergencies such as Afghanistan and Ukraine. So this combination of the humanitarian visa, the possibility of staying permanently, either through the asylum system, the asylum pathway, or to the residency migratory pathway, were both open. And combined with the support with diaspora, civil society organizations, and the strengthening of local public policies and efforts may be the key for the development of a community sponsorship program in Brazil, which would be a program that would be able to benefit refugees from other crises around the world. I think one of the main lessons here is that there is a place for developing countries such as Brazil to provide their fair share of contribution in terms of offering support and places in crisis, even the most remote ones. Of course, it is easier with the right advocacy efforts for governments to open space for these crises, because unlike the situation in Venezuela, for example, where almost 700,000 people came to Brazil, and this is more pressing, we have a neighboring situations like Afghanistan and Ukraine, we don't expect a large influx of people coming to Brazil. So somehow it is easier to mobilize the political will to create a specific pathway for this crisis. On the other hand, the challenge is to provide the actual support for the local public policies, which are the cities and municipalities and states in a continental federation-sized country like Brazil, are the local authorities that are going to receive and welcome and provide services for the people coming. And not all of them are prepared enough. There are not enough experience, not enough sheltering spaces. The policies here in Brazil, education, health, and social assistance are universal and are entitled to all of them, but not necessarily prepared to welcome large families. Like in the cases of Afghanistan that we are seeing, they speak languages that not at all similar to the ones to Portuguese, and some of them speak English, and here in Brazil are also not prepared for this. So there's a huge language and cultural barriers depending on the nationalities that are coming. So I think on one hand, it is easy for countries in Latin America and other regions to open pathways, to have this political will, and Brazil can be an example. It was done through a decree very easily, but in one hand, it is easy to open the pathway. On the other hand, you have to have the knowledge to support and structure the support networks and systems and the local public policies, that they are the ones that are going to provide services for these families and support with language inclusion, health and education, and social assistance, and so on.
Thank you. I think this is an important point with all displacement situations. I think to where support is in one often hailing into people who are displaced, but often the local population is then left alone with the huge task of indeed providing the necessary integration. I think a very, very valid point for any program that builds up complementary to other pathways, particularly those, I think, that are very much shouldered by civil society and by the communities. And this is for me always this question: how sustainable can it be then if at some point I think the state also needs to come in again, or other providers. I would like at this point to again invite you all to post your questions into the on YouTube into the respective Q&A or section. We received some 2 questions, and the one I would like directly to bring into Raul now, actually. And it's I think a question that very often comes in such displacement situations where we say, well, often. So I read it out. The critique with third country solutions such as resettlement or complementary pathways is that due to their small scale, often compared to the displacement situation, they're only a drop in the ocean. So from your perspective, can in the Ukrainian context non-EU pathways elevate the pressure member states are feeling? And additionally, also interesting, also, do you actually view pathways to non-EU countries as solidarity with EU member states or with Ukrainians who have relatives in the US or Canada or wish to build their lives there? after all, the EU is one of the strongest economic regions. I think a very valid questions. Could you probably go back to these two questions from your perspective?
Thank you, Martin. For me, the main objective, is that of providing providing support to Ukrainians who flee the war. Clearly, the European Union is a neighboring region of Ukraine, and this explains the fact that the European Union is hosting most of those that flee the war, those that are refugees. But I think that rather than seeing it as a drop of the ocean, I see that any initiative to promote pathways is very, very, very meaningful. And actually, our aim is to promote them as much as possible. As I said, with the overall objective of really providing support to those fleeing the war. So it is true that geography matters. We've referred to 700 Venezuelans going to Brazil. There's also the fact that some Ukrainians who are now hosted in the EU, also within the European Union, have preferences as to where they go. Diaspora plays a role. The fact that Ukrainians share history and a lot of cultural affinities with some of our member states in the bordering the eastern border also plays a role. So there are many elements. But overall, our objective is to provide support to those fleeing the war, and all the initiatives, including traditional resettlement and complementary pathways, are very welcome, and we want to promote them further.
Thank you. There would be one more question. We touched upon a bit, but I would invite whoever would like, because we spoke at the beginning, and actually most of you also raised this point, this temporariness of many of the initiatives is in one way or the other a critical point, because we see that the conflict continues, and we see this in other conflicts. More and more they get protracted, more and more they get rather permanent than temporary. So probably I would ask Corinne to come in here. How is this perspective in the long term, and probably also Susan, you already alerted to it, but probably also to you from the US perspective. How is there already some planning in this direction, how to make it more sustainable, more permanent, should the situation, the crisis continue?
Thank you, Martin. So there are existing pathways to permanence in the Canadian context. So any of the SUAT visa holders who have arrived, as I said, can apply to, first of all, if they just want to stay temporarily, can apply to extend their open work permit or their study visa within the 10 years. But if they do want to stay permanently, they can just apply for permanent residence over time and become Canadian citizens. And we would welcome them to do that.
And to come back to the situation in the US, as I mentioned at the beginning, the program, while it's been very, very nimble and very able to respond quickly to what's happening on the ground and allow a large number of people to, much larger than through the normal resettlement program, to actually enter the US. One of the main challenges is the fact that the status that individuals will have is very precarious. So the visa is only, not visa, there's no visa. The parole program, it only lasts for 2 years. And after that, there will be likely be the possibility for their status to be renewed. But there is no formal route to permanent residency under a parole program. Individuals will have to either apply for asylum, and the Us Asylum Program is extremely backlogged. When Afghan refugees were admitted through parole last year, the US Congress actually instructed the asylum authorities to prioritize their applications. So that's actually been going quite well. And they've moved very quickly through that. Those who have applied so far have begun to move quickly through that process. That has not happened yet for Ukrainians. So Ukrainians who apply for asylum will be at the back of a very long queue and have to go through, quite a difficult asylum adjudication process. They are able to apply for other types of visas if they're eligible for them, but there's no formal pathway to permanence within this particular program unless the US Congress comes in and makes a change to that. So I'd say it's one of the main limitations of the program, and I think one of the lessons we need to take going forward.
Thank you. Andrew, you wanted to come in? Yeah, please.
For the question, it's really fascinating discussions and some really great insights. I was interested in going back to a point that was made, I think, by Corinne, Susan, and Marie Beatriz, which is public support, engagement by civil society, which has been very significant. But I was wondering also what the extent to which there are trade-offs affecting other groups within the migration and asylum system, and how, I suppose, generally, maybe it could be referred to as the politics of asylum and protection has been affected by the arrival or plans for the arrival of people from Ukraine, whether there have been trade-offs evident more generally within the protection system. Thank you.
I can begin if you'd like. Great question, Andrew. And I think, this has been a huge lesson learned from the Syrian cohort. We have used a whole society approach and a national coordination with weekly calls to players all across the country as our solution to really addressing both the Afghans and the Ukrainian arrivals in a much more coordinated fashion. So we have, if I can use the term, divided and conquered. Because the Afghan refugees are a resettlement cohort, we are using our 41 resettlement agencies. So we meet with them weekly. There's a national committee with regional hubs. In fact, when last August, when the crisis began in Afghanistan, we set up our major airport, the Toronto Pearson International Airport, with 4 hotel hubs. So we brought in our resettlement agencies into Toronto, and immediately those Afghan refugees, when they landed, went into either the British Columbia Hotel, the Prairies Hotel, the Ontario Hotel, or the Atlantic Hotel. And they were immediately given support from those resettlement agencies in those communities while they were in quarantine for 2 weeks because of the pandemic. And then with those same resettlement workers then traveled onward to their final destination where they continued their resettlement journey. So the resettlement agencies were focusing on Afghan refugees, while all of our, as I said, 550 settlement agencies have been focusing on Ukraine. And so from a capacity perspective, I think it's actually been a good thing that we brought the Ukrainians in on a temporary visa and then converted our settlement eligibility to allow them to provide support to those Ukrainian nationals. Because also for Ukraine, we have this weekly national call with all of the provinces, municipalities, all of the settlement agencies across Canada, including the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And they are, we provide them the latest updates for the week. They identify to us what are the issues on the ground. And I can tell you, and I'm sure that Susan and Maria are facing this as well as Raul, housing is the biggest issue to address. There is no permanent housing in Canada. 90% of our hotels are already booked. So it has been very, very challenging to try to find even temporary accommodation for thousands and thousands of both Afghan and now Ukrainians. But because we have, resettlement agencies and settlement agencies, we've been able to divide and conquer and have them focus on, certainly because we are in control of the Afghan refugees arriving, because of we were able to destine them to the 41 communities that we've established, we're pushing them out into the second and third tier cities. We're working with our Canadian Border Services Agency and the IOM to send charters to smaller airports in smaller communities so that it leaves space in the larger cities for Afghans that are just arriving on commercial flights as well as Ukrainians. And so it's been an opportunity to, as they say, never let a good crisis pass you by. As I said, even for a country like Canada, who has a long history and an established resettlement country, this has been very, very challenging for us. I don't know if my other colleagues want to comment as well.
I'm happy to jump in on that also. I think, as Corinne mentioned, in the US as well, the experience has the potential to be complementary rather than truly complementary pathways rather than actually duplicating or replacing existing programs. The US is in the process of launching a more permanent private sponsorship program, and that process has been a bit delayed by first Afghanistan and now Ukraine. But I think that the experience of the Uniting for Ukraine program has the potential to really feed into and strengthen that model, because it's been an opportunity to really pilot a lot of the types of coordination that will need to happen, and also to really draw attention on the part of the public to this possibility. Going forward, I think the issue will really be figuring out how to build out that support and those lessons learned in a much more structural way, and in a way that avoids some of the issues of precarity and lack of access to some core services that have been issues with Uniting for Ukraine. I think that, as Corinne mentioned, there's also an important exercise in figuring out where sponsors, or more broadly volunteers, as we're looking at these programs in general, are able to come in and play a complementary role, even alongside existing resettlement programs or visa programs. And that's something that I think we can draw lessons on for resettlement programs also in other countries, as we're sort of looking at the broader scope of and role of complementary pathways. There's things like sponsorship that can tap into that support in a very concrete, visible way, but we should also be looking at and thinking through where volunteers, some form of sponsorship can be complementary to our programs and really add value, whether it's on something like housing, or simply providing newcomers with networks, those sorts of things. It doesn't have to just be through an existing sponsorship program. There are a lot of creative ways to make these models work in particular contexts and for specific crises.
And just in my perspective, my opinion is that the complementary pathways program would only benefit in every way the protection of refugees coming to Brazil. First, because as I said, we are experimenting probably the one experience of a private sponsorship program resettlement for Brazil. So the solidarity behind the arrivals through these complementary pathways in the case of Afghanistan and now in the case of Ukraine has been allowing us to strengthen this advocacy with the federal government and also with civil society organizations, and feel if there would be, what kind of interest would it be for a private sponsorship program to be established in Brazil. And also it has been assisting the protection networks to be more flexible and to have a more comprehensive understanding and tools on how to welcome different nationalities. Because here in Brazil, the civil society organizations and networks were kind of molded and costumed to welcome a certain type of refugees and asylum seekers. So in the beginning, they knew very much how to support those coming from some countries in Africa, Angola, DRC and so on. And then the Haitian influx came. They were accustomed to welcome this influx. And then a little bit of Syria, but it was not such as a big influx. And now Venezuelan and from those from Latin America. So the whole network has been, in the last 4 years, been very accustomed and prepared to how to deal with and document and support and talk to those coming from Venezuela. Coming now from last year, big Afghan families speaking Pashtun and Dari, needing a specific type of accommodation as a specific type of support, and now Ukraine. This has been supporting somehow the protection networks to be more flexible and to be more forthcoming and to be able to support a broader type of movements and refugees and from different nationalities. So now we have civil society organizations, municipalities and groups that have learned different languages, and now they know how to support. Now they know who to refer. So I think opening these pathways are beneficial in countries such as Brazil in all ways. This can become a permanent resettlement program in the private sponsorship way, changing the paradigm on how resettlement should or could be in a country such as Brazil, and allow, if the right support comes in, allow the protection networks to be more expert in providing support to different kinds of networks, different kinds of nationalities and influxes.
Thank you. Before I hand back to Andrew, we come already close to the end. I think it would be also interesting from Raul to hear what you can take, what the Commission can take out of these initiatives, and is there also some momentum here within the European Union to build up on such newly emerging initiatives, call them complementary pathways, or however, would be also interesting still to hear from you.
Thank you very much. And very briefly, yes, as I said, we welcome those initiatives, and actually there are plenty of initiatives of beyond resettlement of complementary legal pathways into the European Union. So we see that from with vulnerable people and refugees coming from Afghanistan, also from Libya. We see plenty of initiatives that are happening to our member states. So as we set out in our pact, the European Pact for Migration and Asylum, that we presented in September 2020, so soon 2 years ago, we want to step them up, these complementary legal pathways. What we want is an orderly migration to the European Union, reduce irregular ways to come to the Union in order to pave the way for more legal pathways.
Thank you very much from my side. I think we are over. I don't see any question in the chat. I guess there's none waiting anymore. So I will hand over to Andrew to conclude from my side. Thanks a lot to all of you. I very much enjoyed this conversation, and would like to build up on this and stay in touch for more information. Thank you very much from my side. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Just to briefly conclude, because I think this has been a really fascinating conversation, but it's an ongoing issue. And what I would say is that here at the European University Institute, we're working closely with ICMPD. So this isn't the end of something. We would hope to see this as the beginning of a conversation, but also I think because of the issues that have been raised in this webinar around kind of the public and governmental responses, civil society organisation, the kind of innovations that have been introduced, the sharing of ideas and information, and also the consideration of downstream challenges. I think there's a number of really important points have been raised in this webinar, which we would hope to be able to revisit, and also through the work that we do in ICMPD or here at the European University Institute, and also with our other partners and collaborators, contribute to helping to share information and develop effective responses. So I think I'd like to thank all of the speakers for their insights, and I think the format has worked really nicely in really allowing us to cover a lot of ground. And also for the people who asked questions or joined us online, we're really grateful. The webinar will also go on to our YouTube channel, the Migration Policy Centre, and I think it'd be a really valuable resource for people to return to because of the insights that have been shared with us. I was going to say this afternoon, but also this morning, depending on where you are, or even this evening for some people. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, and particularly to our speakers.